All right, the demonstration for tonight is a little bit longer than usual, but it's a question I get just about every week, in addition to how to print out a PDF pattern, which we covered last week. This week, I wanted to talk about how to enlarge or decrease a pattern, such as if you had a family member or a customer requesting maybe a Sew Sweetness project, but they wanted it either bigger or smaller than what it is in the pattern. And so I had my friend Christina help me out. By the way, a link to Christina's website is in the comments. Christina helped me out with the first half of the discussion, which was how to increase or decrease by a certain percentage. I'm not a math person, and so I really appreciated Christina's guidance for the first half of the show demonstration. And then the second half will be a different method, how to increase or decrease by the slash and spread method. So enjoy Christina's demonstration on printing at different percentages. Hey everybody, today I'm going to be discussing how to increase or decrease pattern pieces. A lot of times, especially if you're working for a Sew Sweetness pattern and you'd like it to be either bigger or smaller for whatever you're using it for. I'm going to be showing you two different ways to do that. One is by printing using different percentages and also combining some calculations in there. And then the second method will be for slash and spread, kind of hands-on with the pattern pieces. So today I am very grateful that Christina has joined me to discuss how to enlarge or decrease pattern pieces, and I'm particularly grateful that she's joining me for this discussion because I'm not a math person, and I also have to add that as a designer of the pattern, I've actually never used this method to change sizes of pattern pieces because I draft my pattern pieces on my computer, and if I need to change them, such as if I need multiple sizes for a project, such as small, medium, and large, I'll just do that in the software, and I really don't have to usually think about math for that process. So thank you so much, Christina. And by the way, links to Christina's social media are in the description, so you can check that out also. So thank you for doing this.
You're welcome.
For
Being
me
married to an
personally,
engineer who loves math has its benefits.
yeah, it sure does. And I kind of wish I paid a little bit more attention to math in school. But needless to say, my first question for you is, how often do you enlarge or decrease a bag or a pouch's size, and what are the reasons that you're usually doing that for?
Usually for me, because I have a small business, it's because of customer need. So, for example, I had a customer who came to me and said, I need a backpack that is 18 inches high, this wide, and I need the gusset to be 9 inches. Okay, let's go. So she picked out the base pattern that she wanted, and then I went from there to figure out the calculations. That particular pattern ended up being 147% with a 9-inch gusset that was calculated separately.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Are you doing
So
something like
usually
that
for me,
often?
that's what it is.
Are you doing that often?
Yes and no. It really depends. There are times where I might have a panel that is too big for a pattern, but it's too small for the next size up. So I'm going to go on an in-between. Brian actually made a park sling because Danny started making one, and he said, I need to do this. And he's like, the big's too small, the small's too small. The big's too big, the small's too small. I need something in between. So his first pattern that he ever made was a custom size.
Oh my gosh.
He's crazy.
Yeah, I was thinking that. I didn't want to say it, but is that the most common thing that you've ever most unique thing that you've ever resized, or if not, what is?
Probably trying to figure out a backpack specifically. It was for D&D game stuff. Okay. So she was a D&D master, and that's what she needed to carry all of her stuff to her game nights.
Okay, I got it. Very interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of different things that people would like to have specific carrying uses for. Yeah, I can see that.
Exactly. Like, I like this bag, but it's too small. Or I like this bag, but it's too big.
Do you have a bag or pouch with you, perhaps, that you can hold up that you've
I do not have any handy because mine generally are here and then they're out the door.
Gotcha.
So I actually don't have any that I've increased handy. I think actually the next one, I don't even know what the next one I'm going to increase is.
Got it. No,
I've got
problem.
a list of stuff that I've got to do.
We'll put a picture up sometime during this video of, I have an airplane bag picture in mind where I have the regular size one and then also a smaller one and then a much bigger one. So we'll try to fit that picture in sometime during the discussion. All right, so let's get down to the actual math part of all of this. Is there a formula for enlarging or decreasing?
There is. Well, there's two ways you can go at it. So you can just say, I want it to be bigger, and you can just calculate what 125% would be, or if you want smaller, start at 90%, and then you can take your original sizes and do that math. So like for the tower crossbody, it is a length of 10 by 11.5 by 1.5. So if you math that out to at 125%, you would take your 10 and multiply it by 1.25, which is 125%. So then your length becomes 12.5, your height becomes 14 and 3/8, and your depth is 1 and 7/8.
Okay.
So it's not a ton bigger, but if you're looking to carry your iPad in it, 125% would probably work. If you want something that's a little smaller because you're making it for a toddler or whatever the case is, the math is exactly the same, but you would multiply it by 0. Whatever you want to reduce it to. So 90% would be 0.9. So you would multiply that 10 by 0.9, you get 9 inches. So instead of your length being 10 inches, now you've shrunk that by an inch. Now the other way to figure out your final size and get your weird percentage, like I had to do with my 18-inch high backpack, because I knew an actual number. So rather than sitting there and playing with percentages over and over again, you can take your, let me make sure I don't do this backwards. You take your original size and divide it by, let me do this math really, really quick because I think I'm going to say this backwards. Excel decided to fail me. Okay, so you would actually take, you want the number that you want it to be, so you take your 18 and divide it by your 10. And that would get you your percentage that you need. So if you want it to be 18 wide and it's originally 10, then it would be 180% to get to that 18 inches wide.
Okay.
So
can
you
say
would
that,
take your,
can you say that one more time just for my math?
Yeah. So you take
brain
your desired number, whichever, whether it's how wide you want it or how tall you want it. So that measurement divided by the original.
Okay, so your customer wanted the 18-inch long bag, but
height.
the original height. But the original was 10 inches high, so
yeah,
approximately.
Somewhere around, well, it was, that particular bag I think was like 12 or 14, whatever it was. But so it worked out to be 147%. For the tower, if they wanted 18 wide on the tower, you would divide 18 by 10. Yep, and that's 180%. So that would get you a pretty large bag.
Okay, got it. All right. Now I have a graphic to put on the screen, and maybe we can talk about, we're using this example of the tower crossbody bag just because it has more pieces than just a single piece, but the front and back of the bag are made using just this piece. And so I thought this is a free pattern also, and I thought it would be easier to talk about enlarging and decreasing this bag. Okay, so I have a graphic up on the screen that Christina prepared previously, and we're just using the examples of enlarging and decreasing. So the enlarged pattern pieces are going to be 125% for this example, and the decreased pattern pieces are going to be 90% for this example. So that's why you see in the charts 125% and 90%. So Christina, would you walk us through the charts on the screen and what the numbers mean?
Sure. So at the top, it's like I had previously talked about what your sizes will end up being when you math. So just the breakdown of if you increase a bag to 125%, what those measurements would be, and if you decrease it to 9%, what those measurements would be. The two larger boxes on the kind of in the middle, the one on the left is the raw calculations of doing that math. So for each of these percentages, to increase, I multiplied it by 1.25%, and to decrease, I multiplied it by 0.9, which matches our 125% and our 90%. But as you can see, we get some decimals that are not pretty and not easy to translate into the rulers that we have that we deal with that are eighths and quarters and thirds. It just doesn't work when you have 13.4375. And this is what happens when you increase things. So you're going to have to do a little bit of rounding. So I also put a decimal fractions conversion on the side, which has the most common fractions that we use in sewing. And you're kind of looking for the one that's going to be closest to what you have. And they generally will come together. I mean, I haven't had major problems with things coming together using rounding because it's so small that it really doesn't blow anything up or anything like that.
Okay. And are you always rounding up?
I generally stick to the elementary school methods of rounding, you know, what we learned in elementary school, because if it's closer to a number, you don't want it to be too big, especially when you're talking about zipper panels. A zip pocket, I'm probably not going to worry as much because it's a zip pocket. Like, you're probably not going to get it caught in the seams. You can fold it over. You're probably going to be fine with any kind of zip pocket. But your lining zip panels, you generally want to be as close as you can.
Okay.
But when you're getting into hundredths and thousandths of an inch, it's not going to make a difference.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so these two charts over here are the pieces in the pattern that are squares and rectangles, because as you've mentioned, you need to do some math to get those pieces either enlarged or decreased to your chosen percentage. But what are you doing for the pieces that you're actually printing out on your printer?
So the pieces that I'm printing on my printer, I'm opening them in Adobe. And when you go to print, in your print dialog screen, there's going to be an option that says poster. And when you select that for your increased patterns, it's going to print those pieces on multiple pages that you can then piece together.
Okay.
If you're decreasing, you do not need to use poster because the pages, we already know the pieces already fit on a page at 100%. So if you're making them smaller, they're still going to fit on that piece of paper.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then the other things that you do need to math are your zippers. Because if you're increasing, like for a zipper pocket, if you're decreasing to 90% and you use the same, I don't remember what size zipper it is for the tower, but let's call it an 8-inch zipper. If you use the same 8-inch zipper and you decrease, you're gonna trim after you insert it. Have a great day. But when you're enlarging, you need to make sure that you account for that when you cut your zipper or zipper tape, whatever it is that you choose to use. Otherwise, it may not fit your hole, or it may not be big enough to close your bag.
Okay, that makes sense. One more question that I had about printing pattern pieces. You mentioned the poster, or if you're decreasing, you can just leave it the same. Are you just typing that chosen percentage in? So for example, 125%, are you just actually
Correct.
typing that in? Okay.
Yep. So where you would normally either, for me, my printer likes it when I put my patterns on 100% rather than actual size. For whatever reason, actual size is not actually actual size with my Canon printer.
Okay.
So mine is always set at 100. So if I am increasing, I do poster and then change that percentage there. And then have to remember to put it back when I go to do another
That's a good tip.
pattern.
And there's one more box on this page over here, this graphic, seam allowance changes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So seam allowance changes is one of those things that anybody who increases and decreases is going to have an opinion about. But the logic behind it is pretty much any pattern you buy in the United States has seam allowance included. Any indie pattern maker is going to have seam allowance included. If you increase a pattern piece to 125%, you've now added an extra 25% to the seam allowance that was allocated by that designer.
Okay.
Now, if it is not a piece together, like with angles or like the zipper opening on the chickadee type of thing, you can probably get away with using the same seam allowance. However, I have made a bag that has angles from another designer for a friend of mine for Christmas at 140%, I think it was, because she wanted a giant rehearsal bag. She's a theater girl.
Okay.
And I didn't change the seam allowance. And I put the sides on, and guess what? Stuff's not fitting together. Because it expects the seam allowance. And once I increased it, it expected that new seam allowance.
I see.
The same goes for decreasing, except I never go below a quarter. Because if you go below a quarter when we're making bags and you have all of those layers, you run the risk of easily missing a layer and ending up with a hole, and nobody wants that when they flip their bag. So if you are decreasing and your seam allowance is a quarter from the beginning, you may need to trim things to fit together because, again, now the pattern thinks that the seam allowance is smaller. So your pieces are going to end up bigger than what the pattern expected. So it's the opposite. So they're going to end up too big. So you might have to do some trimming.
Is it okay, especially with a small percentage change, to perhaps leave the seam allowance as it was in the pattern and just kind of, as you're pinning, maybe see how it goes to see if you need to change it?
You can. And like you can see on this chart, like at 125%, if it was a 3/8, you end up with a 4/9 seam allowance, which is kind of a pain in the tuchus because nobody has a thing to measure 4/9. So at that point, you're just going to end up rounding that a little bit, which is what you can see I ended up doing on the bottom with the half. At 90%, it was also 4/9. And I'm like, all right, 4/9 is pretty close to a third.
Okay.
So there, like a third is easier. Does your thingy have a third? Your thingy does not have a third. I'm looking at my seam guide that is sitting right next to me. I'm like, does this have a third? It does not. So you might have to do a little more work to be able to tape off a third if you're like me and use washi tape because your machine bed doesn't have a lot of.
Sense. So probably silly question, but how did you calculate the seam allowance changes?
I just multiplied the original by, so 0.25 times 1.25 is,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, again, the non-math person in the room.
And if you are not great at math, but you can remember that you need to multiply by 1 point whatever you want your increase or 0 point whatever you want your decrease, and you have Excel or Google Sheets, I would need to double check Google Sheets. But in Excel, if you right click and hit Format Cell, there's an option for fraction, and it will automatically convert your decimal to a fraction. It may not be a pretty fraction, but it will be a fraction.
Okay, so I had another question about changing the sizes of the pieces. Which pieces do you usually leave as is?
I always leave my straps the same, your zipper tabs, because the width of your zipper itself does not change. Any D-ring type connectors, because that's dependent on the size of the hardware that you're using.
Okay.
If it's a backpack and it has a loop, I don't change the loop size. I might decide to increase the height just a little bit if it looks weird. Like if I iron it and hold it up there and it looks like itty bitty, then I might recut another one. But really, that's personal preference. If you do like 147% backpack and you cut that piece at 140%, that's a really big loop. It almost ends up like a handle on a chickadee. So those are pieces that generally you want to leave alone.
Okay, well, this has been a really great education for me. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge about changing pattern pieces with us. So thank you so much, Christina.
You're welcome.
Okay, I just wanted to step over to my computer and show you on my screen what Christina was talking about regarding the poster settings. So I've got my Tower crossbody bag open in Adobe Reader, and I'm going to open my print settings box. And I'm just going to select one of the pages that I know has the pattern pieces. As you can see, here's the preview of my pattern piece. And here's what she was talking about, the poster setting. So I'm going to click that, and it's asking for what size. And so Christina was giving an example earlier with enlarging at 125%. So I'm going to click that, and as you can see, it slices it into two portions because it's printing at a larger percentage. So then you can go ahead and hit print after that.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about a second method for enlarging or decreasing. So for this example, I'm going to use my Baker Street bag pattern piece. So the Baker Street bag has a main panel, which is the front and the back of the bag, and it also has a panel that wraps around the sides and the bottom. So I'm going to say for this example that I want to make my main panel piece, my bag, I want it to be 2 inches taller. So I've got my piece printed out and an extra scrap of paper, and I'm just going to take my ruler, making sure that I have a straight edge perpendicular to this cut on the fold edge, and I'm just going to pick a spot. It doesn't have to be exact center, just pick a spot to draw a horizontal line. So the reason this is called slash and spread is I'm going to cut this piece into two separate pieces, which is the slash part, and then we're going to spread it by 2 inches because we want the bag to be 2 inches taller. So first off, I'm going to start by just taping this piece somewhere on my scrap piece of paper. This will basically be a background for slashing my two pieces. And then because I want it to be 2 inches taller, I'm going to measure from where the pattern piece ends 2 inches higher than that. And I'm just going to go ahead and draw a line straight across. So I'm going to place the second piece at this line, and it needs to be matching up with this straight edge, the cut on the fold edge. So I'm actually going to go ahead and also draw a vertical line that's even with this straight edge of the pattern piece. So I'm going to go ahead and place this piece again. This section is 2 inches because that's what I decided. I wanted my piece to be 2 inches higher. And I'm going to make sure that the straight side edge is aligned with the edge that I just drew, and then I'm going to tape it in place. So once it's taped in place, sometimes you might need to do a little bit of finessing with this pattern piece. As you can see, I'm going to place the ruler over here. As you can see, there's a difference. It's sort of, it will create a jagged edge if you just leave it as is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect this portion over here with the top corner to create a new side edge. And I'm actually going to start with this edge, and there we go. Okay, so I'm going to draw a new side edge. Okay, so my new pattern piece, let me go ahead and just cut this edge out so you can see what it will look like. This will be my new main panel pattern piece. And my side panel piece for this particular bag is one long rectangle because it's sewn through the sides and the bottom of the bag. So to my length of the long rectangle, I'm not only adding just 2 inches once, I actually have to add it twice because remember, this is a mirror image piece. This is only half of the piece. So we have to add 2 inches for this extra slice, and then on the other half of the mirror image piece, we need to add an extra 2 inches. So 2 inches plus 2 inches equals 4 inches. And that's not necessarily exact. When you're pinning your piece, you might notice you maybe need to trim a little bit off. But this will get you very, very close to the side panel piece that you need. So again, this is the slash and spread method. You can use either the printing at different percentages or this method, and you might need to do the slash and spread for more than one pattern piece, but I started with the Baker Street bag as an example because it's just got the front main panel piece for the front and back of the bag. So hopefully this helps figuring out how to increase or decrease your pattern pieces when you're making a bag or pouch larger or smaller. All right, so Danny's going to put a picture up on the screen. This is from our retreats a few years ago. This is a good demonstration of decreasing and increasing a pattern. So the green bag with the squirrels is the original aeroplane bag.
I'll go back.
Danny's going to put the picture up one more time. The tiny one my friend Vanessa made, that's obviously a decrease of the aeroplane bag. And Colleen made the large one with the cats. That's the increase of the pattern. So same pattern, original with the increase and the decrease. And thanks, Danny. I also had a few other things that I wanted to cover as far as the pattern pieces. Danny, could you switch to the overhead camera one more time? Thank you. All right, so here's that, maybe you could zoom out just a little bit. So here's that pattern piece that I used in the cut and slash method. I did show how to make the pattern piece taller, but you can also make it wider as well if you wanted to make, say, if you wanted to make your Baker Street bag longer as well as taller. If it's a pattern piece that's cut on the fold, generally you can add the width to the cut on the fold area. So for instance, if you wanted this to be 2 inches longer, because this is cut on the fold and it's a mirror image half, I would just add 1 inch to the cut on the fold, and that would total 2 inches in length after that. So just remember you're doubling this. If your pattern piece does not have a cut on the fold, you can just do the cut and slash method same way that I did with this horizontal piece, but you'll instead go down the center of the piece and slash it that way and spread it however big that you want to make it. Another thing that I wanted to mention, which I've talked about in the show in the past, I always keep this little piece of double fold bias tape around. And another tip for figuring out your, say, that side panel piece that I was talking about that wraps around the sides and the bottom, especially when I'm designing a pattern, I use this almost every single pattern that I design, and it doesn't just have to be on a design level. You can also use it when you're enlarging or decreasing a pattern. So what I'll do, here's my pattern piece. I'll just sort of lay that double fold bias tape on the top corner, and I'll kind of work it around. Again, like I mentioned before, with the increases, it gets you really close, but sometimes you need to make a little adjustment. So what I'll do, so this is, I'll take, obviously you can take a pen and mark that, but usually I just take my fingernail. And then for my side panel piece, my new side panel piece, it'll be 16.5 times 2 because again, this is just half of the bag. And that'll give me a good close measurement for my new side panel piece. Again, that's the piece that wraps around the sides and the bottom. And Dan, you could switch back to the front camera, because I also wanted to share with you, especially if this is your first time increasing or decreasing a pattern, also if you're using perhaps an expensive fabric or a fabric that can't be replaced, like an out of print fabric, let's say. Here's my little prototype that I made for the Marlin backpack, and it's kind of similar. If you're a garment sewer, you're probably very familiar with making muslins, but if you're not a garment sewer, this is basically a muslin for a bag. So here's the original actual finished Marlin backpack. As you can see, it has a lot of the extra bells and whistles that my little prototype doesn't. So this is basically just the bare bones part of the backpack. And what you can do is you can sew this together. Again, I do have the zipper, but there's no lining inside. It's just the exterior pieces that you see. And the reason I like to use foam is because I can visually see how everything's coming together. Of course, you can use a muslin fabric if you like, but if you are using the foam, I recommend just sewing with a long basting stitch. For example, on my machine, I would use a 4mm stitch to sew this together on my machine. Make sure all the pieces fit together. And then because you've used the basting stitch, it should be relatively easy to take your seam ripper and just take the pieces apart so you can still use them for your project, so you're not wasting foam. But this is another good practice for making sure the main pieces fit together before you start working on your either enlarged or decreased project, just to make sure everything fits together like you think it will. So that demonstration, again, the two different methods, I guess we'll call it the math method and the non-math method, but gives you two different options for increasing and decreasing. I know for those that are not so fond of math, the math part might seem overwhelming. I will be posting this video tomorrow to my blog with that little graphic with all the numbers and the charts on it, so you can take a look. I think, especially if it's your first time increasing or decreasing, starting with a pattern that doesn't have a whole lot of pieces, such as that Baker Street bag that I was using, or even the Tower Crossbody bag, which I mentioned in the video was just the front and the back pieces. Starting with something with less pieces so you get more comfortable is a good way to sort of dip your toes in and get some practice in. For example, working on a project with tons of pieces like I think I have it behind me. Like the triple threat briefcase. This has a whole lot of pieces to it. And so I'm not saying this is not doable for increases or decreases, but it's a good idea not to get overwhelmed, and starting with a project with less pieces is, let's see, the camera's focusing, there we go, on something else, is a good way to get started. So I know there were a few questions coming through, so Danny's going to put some of them on the screen, questions in regards to the increasing and decreasing. Teresa says, don't you have to remove the seam allowance before doing the math? So in the example with the percentages, Christina had the calculations on the chart in the bottom. I think it was on the bottom right-hand corner of the chart. So you can, I spoke to a few friends about printing at different percentages. Some of them left the seam allowance as is and did not change it. But Christina mentioned that she's tried to do that in the past, and depending on the pattern and depending on how the pieces fit together, sometimes it's helpful to increase or decrease the seam allowance also by the same percentages. Jamie says, can you just change the printing settings to the larger or smaller percentage? You can. The issue with that is in my patterns, pattern pieces are not present for all of the pieces, such as the squares and the rectangles. So while it is useful to just go ahead and go into your printer settings to print your actual pieces at different percentage, that leaves you with either the math for the squares or rectangles, or you can hand draw and scan into your printer if you have that capability, the squares and the rectangles, save them, and then reprint them at a different percentage. So that's another option as well. Elizabeth says, are you sharing the spreadsheets? Yes, I will have that posted tomorrow on the blog, the spreadsheets, as well as the standalone video and the video. Danny's going to edit it out so it includes these follow-up questions as well, because I think some of these would be helpful to others too. Diane says, I see a notation at the bottom of your sheet regarding seam allowances. How do I ensure when reducing there is sufficient seam allowance? So Christina recommended, even when you're decreasing, not to go below 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, even if the percentage has changed to tell you otherwise. Just because, and I agree with this, sewing anything smaller than 1/4 of an inch seam allowance leaves you open to perhaps missing layers when you're sewing things together, perhaps having holes in part of your seam. And so I would stick with 1/4 of an inch being the smallest seam allowance, even when you're reducing. Sarah says, if poster increases the size for you, why do the math unless I misunderstood poster? So that's correct. When you're, like I mentioned, when you're printing the pattern pieces, it only covers, at least in my patterns, the pieces that are represented by actual pattern pieces, not the squares or rectangles. Another option, and I don't know what the possibility of this is at your local printer copy shop if they have different sized papers, but for some of the new patterns, we do have pattern pieces for AO pages, which is large format copy shop pages. Depending on what is offered at your local copy shop, perhaps they could get that printed for you at Smaller or larger percentages might need to be poster size still, but that's another option. I haven't investigated that, but something to keep in mind as well. Michelle says this method only enlarges one direction, right? So you can, Danny, could you switch back to the overhead camera?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So you can use the slash and spread either way. It can either go horizontally, it can go vertically, or it can be both. So if you're doing both, you'll just do one at a time. So you'll do perhaps horizontal first, and then if you are using the slash and spread for a vertical, then you'll do that one second. Also, like I mentioned, if it's a cut on the fold situation, you can just add half of your increase to the cut on the fold. So for a 2-inch increase, I would just add 1 inch. My paper's not quite big enough for the whole piece, but it would just be this extra section over here. Thank you, Danny. Were there any other questions about the increase or decrease? Thank you. Rob says, I did the slash and spread on a cavalcade bag. That required adjustments to a bunch of pieces. I cut all the pieces out in paper, then taped them together. Doing the paper mock-up saved me. And I think someone emailed me a couple weeks ago also that she used her modified paper pieces to actually sort of, instead of pinning fabric, which you would pin a side panel piece, what she actually did was she taped her new paper side panel to the piece so she could see how it fit together. I know it's a little bit fiddly with the paper because the paper doesn't bend through the curve quite like the fabric does, but that's another option just so you can sort of see how the pieces will fit together if you have a lot of excess in the side panel, or maybe you have not enough. Threads by Ellie says, with this method, it may be helpful to make registration marks on the original pattern prior to cutting apart. Then when you cut your other pieces, they will still match up. Yeah, that makes sense also, the registration marks. Since you're working from PDF pattern, most likely, it's always easy to make extra copies, but if you're working from an original type of actual physical paper pattern that you bought from a quilt shop, you want to trace that off before you do any changes to the pieces so you can still save your original pieces. Carol says, what about using the proportion scale wheel? That wheel, which is, the name's escaping me right now, it's a little cardboard wheel that I demonstrated on a previous show. I recommended it to someone a couple months ago via email, and they let me know that it was no longer available online. So I'm not sure if that was temporary or permanent, but that little wheel, I think it's the Quilter's proportion scale possibly. That wheel is super helpful, but I kind of skipped talking about it in this demonstration just because when I found out it wasn't readily available, I kind of didn't want to go down that rabbit hole of suggesting it and then people weren't able to find it or buy it.